March 15, 1943. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The P-51 Mustang screamed out of a dive at 450 miles per hour, pulled up hard, and tried to kill its pilot. Captain Robert Hayes fought the stick as the fighter yawed violently to the right. The wings shuddered. The airframe groaned. Through his gunsight, the target pylons scattered across the test range spun like a carnival ride. "Negative control," Hayes barked into his radio. "She's wallowing like a drunk." On the ground, North American Aviation's chief test engineer, James Harrington, scribbled notes, furiously. This was the fourth test flight this week. The fourth time the Mustang had become dangerously unstable during high-speed attack runs. The aircraft was fast, faster than anything the Luftwaffe had. It was beautiful, sleek lines that whispered through the air like a knife. But in combat maneuvers, especially steep dives followed by sharp pull-ups, it handled like a truck with square wheels. "Bring her back," Harrington ordered. "We're done for today." Hayes leveled out at 8,000 feet, his hands still shaking. "What the hell is wrong with this thing?" Nobody knew. The wing design was perfect, on paper. The fuselage was aerodynamically sound. The engine was a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that made the Spitfire legendary. But something was wrong. And if they couldn't fix it, the Mustang would never be more than a fast courier plane. That evening, in a cramped office at Wright Field, 5 men argued over blueprints. Engineers from North American, Army Air Forces officers, aerodynamics specialists. They pointed at diagrams, recalculated numbers, proposed modifications. All of them missed it. Then a quiet voice from the back of the room spoke up. "What if you're thinking about this backwards?" Everyone turned. The man standing near the door wasn't wearing a uniform. He wore a rumpled shirt, wire-rimmed glasses, and carried a slide rule in his breast pocket like a pen. His name was Daniel Harmon. Age 47. High school physics teacher from Pasadena, California. Before the war, he'd spent weekends building bridges for model railroads and teaching force vectors to bored teenagers. Now, somehow, he was standing in a room full of aviation's best minds, about to suggest something that would make them all look like fools. "The wing isn't the problem," Harmon continued, stepping forward. "It's the angle between the wing and the fuselage. Change it by 1 degree, just 1, and the airflow will stabilize during aggressive maneuvers." The room went silent. Then someone laughed. "1 degree?" Harrington scoffed. That's nothing. That won't change anything." Harmon didn't argue. He just pulled out a piece of paper, drew 3 quick diagrams, and laid them on the table. "Bridges," he said quietly. "I've built hundreds. When you change the angle of a support beam by even half a degree, the entire load distribution shifts. Aircraft wings work the same way, they're just flying bridges." The chief engineer stared at the sketches. Then at Harmon. Then back at the sketches. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. What happened next would change aerial warfare forever. But first, they'd have to overcome the most dangerous obstacle in any war, the belief that experts already knew everything. And Daniel Harmon, a man who never designed an aircraft, never flown in combat, never even worked for an aviation company, was about to prove them all catastrophically wrong. Daniel Harmon was not an aeronautical engineer by any measure. He was a high school physics teacher, a weekend bridge enthusiast, and like many men of his generation, someone who never imagined his hobby would intersect with war. Born in 1896 in Springfield, Illinois, he'd studied civil engineering at the University of Illinois, graduating in 1918, just as World War I ended. While his classmates went to work for railroad companies and construction firms, Daniel took a teaching position at Pasadena High School in California. The pay was modest. The prestige was non-existent. But he had summers off, and that's when he truly lived. Every June through August, Daniel built bridges. Not real ones, miniature replicas constructed with balsa wood, steel wire, and obsessive precision. He built suspension bridges modeled after the Golden Gate. Truss bridges inspired by railroad trestles. cantilever designs that seemed to defy gravity. His garage was a laboratory of angles, stress points, and load distributions. He'd construct a bridge, load it with weights until it failed, then rebuild it stronger. Each iteration taught him something new about how forces move through structures. By 1940, he'd built over 200 bridges. Some held 10 times their own weight. Others collapsed under the slightest pressure. But every failure revealed a pattern. Tiny changes in angle created massive changes in strength. A support beam angled at 44 degrees might collapse under 50 pounds. The same beam at 45 degrees could hold 200 pounds. 1 degree. That's all it took. His students thought he was eccentric. His wife thought he was obsessed. But Daniel understood something most engineers overlooked. Geometry isn't just theory. It's the difference between standing and falling. Then came December 7, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Daniel was 45 years old, too old for combat, but not too old to help. He volunteered for the Civil Air Patrol, teaching navigation to young pilots. He consulted on aircraft recognition for civilian defense. But in early 1943, something unexpected happened. The Army Air Forces, desperate for technical expertise, began recruiting civilian specialists, engineers, physicists, mathematicians, anyone who could solve problems faster than the enemy could create them. Daniel received a letter in March 1943. It was cryptic. Your expertise in structural engineering may be valuable to the war effort. Report to Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, for technical consultation. Duration indefinite. He showed the letter to his wife, Margaret. She read it twice. They want you to build bridges? I don't think so, Daniel replied. But whatever it is, it's important. 2 weeks later, he was standing in a hangar at Wright Field, staring at a P-51 Mustang. The North American P-51 was, by all accounts, a miracle of engineering. It was fast, over 400 miles per hour in level flight. It was sleek, designed with a laminar flow wing that sliced through air with minimal drag. And it had range. Thanks to the efficient Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could fly farther than any American fighter. But it had a problem. During combat maneuvers, especially high-speed dives followed by sharp pull-ups, the Mustang became unstable. Pilots reported that the aircraft wallowed or yawed unpredictably. In dogfights, where fractions of a second mattered, this instability was deadly. Engineers had tried everything, adjusting the tail surfaces, modifying the rudder, changing the elevator trim. Nothing worked. Daniel spent his first week at Wright Field observing. He watched test flights. He studied blueprints. He listened to pilots describe the problem in vivid, frustrated detail. It's like the plane doesn't know where it wants to go, one pilot said. You push the stick forward in a dive, pull back hard to aim at a target, and the whole aircraft shudders. You can't hold a steady aim. Daniel asked questions that made the engineers uncomfortable. What's the angle of incidence between the wing and the fuselage? Why does that matter? Humor me. The engineers checked. The wing was mounted at a precise angle, 2.5 degrees nose up relative to the fuselage centerline. It was standard. It was textbook. It was correct. Daniel made a note. Then he asked another question. What happens to airflow over the wing during a high-G pullout? The engineers explained. During aggressive maneuvers, airflow separated from the wing's upper surface, creating turbulence that disrupted stability. And you've tried changing the wing shape? Yes. Doesn't help. What about changing the angle of the wing relative to the fuselage? The room went quiet. That's not how it works, one engineer said carefully. The wing angle is calculated based on cruise efficiency. Changing it would affect everything: lift, drag, fuel consumption. By how much? We don't know. We've never tested it. Daniel smiled. Then maybe you should. The resistance was immediate and fierce. North American Aviation's chief engineer, James Harrington, was a respected aerodynamicist with decades of experience. He designed aircraft that set speed records. He'd trained under pioneers of aviation. And now a high school teacher was suggesting he'd designed the wing wrong. Mr. Harmon, Harrington said slowly, the P-51's wing is one of the most advanced aerodynamic surfaces ever created. The angle of incidence was calculated using wind tunnel data, mathematical models, and years of research. Changing it by 1 degree won't fix anything. It'll just create new problems. Daniel didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't convince people with words. You had to show them. Let me build a model, he said. Just a small one. Test it in your wind tunnel. If I'm wrong, I'll go back to teaching physics. Harrington hesitated. Wind tunnel time was expensive. Every hour cost money and delayed other projects. But something about Daniel's quiet confidence made him pause. Fine, Harrington said. 1 test. 1 model. If it fails, we never speak of this again. Daniel nodded. Deal. That night, alone in a workshop, Daniel began building. Not an aircraft, but a bridge. A flying bridge. And he was about to prove that everything they knew about the P-51 Mustang was incomplete. March 28, 1943. Wright Field Wind Tunnel Facility. Daniel Harmon stood before a scale model of the P-51 Mustang, making modifications that would have horrified any aeronautical engineer watching. He built the model himself over 3 sleepless nights: balsa wood fuselage, tissue paper skin, carved wooden wings. It wasn't pretty. It looked like something a schoolboy would build for a science fair. But the wing angle was different. Using a precision protractor and a level borrowed from the machine shop, Daniel had mounted the wing at 3.5 degrees nose up, exactly 1 degree higher than the production P-51's 2.5 degree angle. The engineers watching him work exchanged skeptical glances. That thing won't even fly straight, one muttered. Daniel ignored them. He'd heard mockery before. Every bridge he'd ever built started with someone saying it wouldn't work. The Wright Field wind tunnel was a massive cylindrical chamber, 20 feet in diameter, capable of generating winds up to 400 miles per hour. It had tested every American aircraft from the B-17 to the P-38. It was precise, expensive, and rarely wrong. At 0900 hours, Chief Engineer Harrington arrived with 2 Army Air Forces colonels. They looked tired, men who'd spent too many nights worrying about aircraft that kept killing pilots for reasons no one understood. Mr. Harmon, Harrington said formally, you have 1 hour of tunnel time. Make it count. Daniel nodded. He carefully mounted his model in the test section, securing it to the force balance system that would measure lift, drag, and stability. The first test was simple: steady-state airflow at 200 miles per hour. The tunnel roared to life. Wind screamed through the chamber. Daniel's model shook slightly but held position. On the instrument panel, needles danced across dials measuring forces in multiple directions. Harrington studied the readings. Lift coefficient is slightly higher than standard. Drag is, actually lower? One of the colonels frowned. That doesn't make sense. Increasing the wing angle should increase drag. Not if the airflow stays attached, Daniel said quietly. Look at the smoke trails. They'd introduced smoke into the airflow to visualize how air moved over the wing. On a standard P-51 model, smoke would separate from the wing's upper surface at certain angles, creating turbulent eddies. But on Daniel's model, the smoke stayed smooth, flowing cleanly over the wing even at high angles of attack. It's stable, Harrington murmured, disbelief creeping into his voice. Now simulate a dive pull-out, Daniel said. The technicians adjusted the model's pitch, angling it nose down as if diving, then rapidly pitching up, simulating the exact maneuver where P-51s became unstable. On a standard model, this maneuver created violent airflow separation. The smoke would burst into chaos. The force measurements would spike erratically. But Daniel's model stayed smooth. The smoke remained attached. The forces built gradually, predictably. No sudden turbulence. No erratic yawing. The room went silent except for the wind tunnel's roar. One of the colonels spoke first. Run it again. They ran it 5 more times. Different speeds. Different angles. Different maneuvers. Every time, Daniel's modified wing performed better than the standard configuration. Harrington stood motionless, staring at the data sheets piling up on the table. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between astonishment and humiliation. Finally, he spoke. "How did you know?" Daniel pulled out a worn notebook, the same one he'd used for 20 years of bridge building. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I guessed. But it was an educated guess." He opened the notebook to a page filled with sketches of bridge supports, each annotated with failure points and stress calculations. "When a bridge fails under load," Daniel explained, "it's almost never because the materials are weak. It fails because forces are flowing through the structure at the wrong angles. Change the angle by even half a degree, and the entire load distribution shifts." He pointed at the P-51 model. "Aircraft wings are the same. They're not just lifting surfaces, they're structural elements channeling massive forces. During a dive pull-out, you're hitting the wing with multiple G-forces from different directions. If the wing isn't angled correctly relative to the fuselage, those forces create turbulent interference." "But the calculations," Harrington began. "The calculations assumed steady-state flight," Daniel interrupted gently. "They didn't account for dynamic maneuvers where airflow changes rapidly. That's when geometry matters more than mathematics." The implications were staggering. If Daniel was right, if a 1-degree change could stabilize the P-51 during combat maneuvers, then every Mustang already built was flying with a fundamental design flaw. But fixing it meant admitting that a high school teacher had solved a problem that had stumped North American aviation's best engineers for months. Harrington made a decision. "We need to test this on a real aircraft. Immediately." "Wait," one of the colonels said. "If we modify a production P-51 and something goes wrong, if this kills the test pilot, then we'll know it doesn't work." Harrington cut him off. "But if we don't test it, and our pilots keep dying because we were too proud to listen to a civilian, that's on us." He turned to Daniel. "Can you supervise the modification?" Daniel hesitated. He'd never worked on a real aircraft before. Never even held a wrench inside a hangar. But he'd built 200 bridges. And he'd learned something important. The principles didn't change just because the scale did. "Yes," he said. "I can." 5 days later, a P-51B Mustang sat in Hangar 7 at Wright Field with its wings partially dismounted. Daniel stood beside the aircraft with a team of mechanics who looked at him like he was insane. "You want us to shim the wing mounts?" the lead mechanic asked. "That's going to change the entire alignment." "By 1 degree, Daniel confirmed. "Nose up." The mechanics exchanged glances. This wasn't how aircraft were modified. You didn't just shove metal shims under wing bolts and hope for the best. But orders were orders. They worked through the night, carefully inserting precision machine shims between the wing root and fuselage mounting points, recalculating angles, checking and rechecking alignment. By dawn, the P-51 sat on the tarmac looking exactly the same as before. But it wasn't. The wing now sat at 3.5 degrees angle of incidence instead of 2.5 degrees. 1 degree. A change so small you couldn't see it with the naked eye. Captain Robert Hayes, the test pilot who nearly lost control during the original flights, walked around the aircraft slowly, his expression skeptical. "Looks the same," he said. "It's not," Daniel replied. Hayes climbed into the cockpit, started the engine, taxied to the runway. And as he lifted off into the Ohio morning sky, everyone on the ground held their breath. What happened next would either vindicate a physics teacher's wild theory, or kill one of America's best test pilots. April 2, 1943. 0847 hours. 12,000 feet above Wright Field. Captain Robert Hayes pushed the modified P-51 into a steep dive, watching the airspeed indicator climb, 350, 380, 420 miles per hour. The ground rushed up. Wind screamed past the canopy. His hands gripped the stick, waiting for the familiar shudder, the yaw, the wallowing instability that had nearly killed him before. He pulled back hard. 4GS slammed him into his seat. The horizon spun. The wings groaned under the load. But the aircraft held steady. No yaw. No wallow. Just smooth, predictable response. Hayes blinked. Pushed the stick forward. Dove again. Pulled up harder this time, 5GS6. The Mustang responded like a perfectly balanced blade. Precise. Controlled. Like the aircraft could feel what he wanted before he even moved the stick. Harmon, Hayes said into his radio, voice tight with disbelief. Whatever you did, it worked. On the ground, Daniel Harmon stood beside the runway, squinting up at the sky. He didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. Just nodded once and scribbled notes in his worn notebook. The test flight lasted 47 minutes. Hayes performed every combat maneuver in the manual. High-speed dives, sharp pull-ups, barrel rolls, split S-turns, simulated gun runs. Each one put massive stress on the airframe, forces that should have created instability. But the modified P-51 flew like it had been designed by someone who understood not just how aircraft worked, but how they should work. When Hayes landed, he climbed out of the cockpit and walked directly to Daniel. "I don't know what you did," the pilot said quietly. "But that's not the same airplane. It aims itself. Like it can hear the wind." Chief Engineer Harrington had been listening to the radio transmissions. His expression was complicated, relief mixed with something that looked like embarrassment. "Mr. Harmon," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. We should have listened sooner." Daniel shook his head. "You listened when it mattered. That's enough." But Harrington wasn't finished. "We need to implement this modification across the entire P-51 production line. Immediately." The two Army colonels who'd witnessed the wind tunnel test nodded in agreement. "How many aircraft are affected?" one asked. "Every P-51 B and C model already delivered," Harrington said grimly. "That's over 400 aircraft. And the ones still in production? Another 2,000 scheduled through the end of 1943. The numbers were staggering. Modifying hundreds of already delivered aircraft would require recalling them from operational units. Halting production to retool assembly lines would delay deliveries for weeks, maybe months. But the alternative was worse, continuing to field fighters that became unstable during the exact maneuvers pilots needed to survive combat. Within 24 hours, orders went out from Wright Field to North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas. All P-51 production was to incorporate the modified wing angle, now officially designated as Modification 1-43A in engineering documents, but known among workers simply as the Harmon angle. Retrofit kits were designed for aircraft already in service. Mechanics would install precision shims at the wing root attachment points, changing the angle of incidence from 2.5 degrees to 3.5 degrees. The modification took approximately 8 hours per aircraft, and required recalibrating instruments to account for the slight change in flight characteristics. But the change created unexpected benefits. During subsequent test flights, pilots discovered that the modified P-51s didn't just handle better in combat maneuvers, they were faster. The improved airflow over the wing reduced drag by approximately 3%, which translated to an extra 12 miles per hour in top speed. That might not sound like much, but in aerial combat where the difference between life and death was often measured in seconds, an extra 12 miles per hour could mean catching an enemy fighter or escaping one. The modification also improved fuel efficiency. The smoother airflow required less power to maintain cruise speed, extending the P-51's already impressive range by nearly 50 miles. And most remarkably, it improved gun accuracy. The P-51's armament, 6.50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, had always been deadly. But during high-G maneuvers, the aircraft's instability had made it difficult to hold a steady aim. With the modified wing angle, pilots could track targets smoothly through turns and dives. The gunsight stayed on target. Bullets went where they were aimed. One test pilot described it as The difference between shooting from a rocking boat and shooting from solid ground. By May 1943, the first combat units began receiving modified P-51s. The 354th Fighter Group, preparing to deploy to England as the first operational Mustang unit in the European theater, received aircraft with the Harmon angle already installed. Their pilots noticed the difference immediately. During training flights over England, they pushed the Mustangs to aggressive maneuvers that would have been dangerous in standard models. The aircraft responded precisely, predictably. "It's like the plane knows what I want before I do," one pilot reported. Another said, "We used to worry about the aircraft fighting us. Now we just worry about the enemy." The tactical implications were profound. Fighter pilots could now commit to attacks with confidence that their aircraft would respond exactly as needed. They could dive steeply, pull up sharply, and immediately acquire a firing solution without the aircraft wallowing through the maneuver. In dogfights, where positioning and timing were everything, this stability gave American pilots a decisive edge. But not everyone was celebrating. Some engineers at North American Aviation were bitter that an outsider had solved a problem they'd been unable to crack. Some military officers questioned whether a civilian should receive credit for a modification that would save countless lives. And some pilots, particularly those who'd been flying P-51s before the modification, insisted the change made no difference, that good pilots could have managed the instability anyway. Daniel Harmon heard the criticism and ignored it. He'd never sought credit. He'd simply seen a problem, applied principles he'd learned building bridges, and proposed a solution. Whether people believed him or not didn't matter. The aircraft flew better. That was enough. December 1, 1943. 28,000 feet above Solingen, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard led 8 P-51B Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group deep into German airspace, escorting a formation of B-17 bombers toward their target. It was the Mustangs' combat debut over Europe. Every pilot knew they were flying aircraft that had been fundamentally changed by a civilian's 1-degree modification. They were about to find out if it mattered. At 1,347 hours, German fighters appeared, Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s, diving out of the sun in a coordinated attack on the bomber formation. Howard called the break. "Bandits 2 o'clock high! Engage!" The P-51s broke formation, turning hard into the attacking Germans. This was the moment that had terrified pilots in unmodified Mustangs, the high G turn at combat speed where the aircraft used to wallow, lose energy, and become vulnerable. But the modified P-51s responded differently. Howard's Mustang rolled smoothly into a climbing left turn, holding altitude and speed. His gunsight tracked a Bf-109 perfectly, no yaw, no wallow, just precise control. He fired a 2-second burst. Tracers stitched across the Messerschmitt's fuselage. The German fighter snap-rolled right, trailing smoke, and dove away. Around him, other Mustangs engaged in turning fights that should have favored the more maneuverable German fighters. But the P-51s held their own, tracking targets smoothly, maintaining energy through turns, responding instantly to pilot input. The dogfight lasted 8 minutes. When the Germans disengaged and fled east, 3 enemy fighters were confirmed destroyed. 2 more were damaged. 0 American losses. Back at base in England, pilots crowded around Howard during the debriefing. "The aircraft tracked like it was on rails," Howard reported. "No instability during high-G maneuvers. Gunsight stayed on target. The Germans couldn't shake us." One pilot added, "I pulled 6 GS in a hard turn. That would have made the old bird shudder. This one just held. Like the plane knew what I needed." The intelligence officer recording the debriefing made a note. "Modified wing angle appears to provide significant combat advantage in turning engagements." Word spread quickly through the fighter squadrons deploying to Europe. The P-51 wasn't just a long-range escort. It was a dogfighter that could challenge the Luftwaffe's best aircraft on equal terms. By early 1944, modified P-51s were arriving in the Pacific theater. The combat environment was different here. less high-altitude fighting, more emphasis on ground attack and long-range patrol. But the modification proved equally valuable. On February 10, 1944, Captain William Shomo of the 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron was flying a P-51 over New Guinea when he encountered a formation of Japanese aircraft, one Mitsubishi Ki-46, Dyna, reconnaissance plane escorted by 12 Nakajima Ki-43, Oscar, fighters. He was alone. Outnumbered 13-1. Standard tactics said to run, call for help, break off, survive. Shomo attacked. He dove on the formation from above, pulled into a high G-turn that brought him onto the tail of the rear Oscar, and fired. The Japanese fighter exploded. He reversed hard, a maneuver that would have left an unmodified P-51 wallowing, and came out behind another Oscar. Another burst. Another kill. For the next 4 minutes, Shomo flew like a man possessed. The modified Mustang responded to every input precisely, allowing him to transition between targets faster than the Japanese pilots could react. By the time he broke off the engagement, he'd shot down 7 aircraft, 6 Oscars and the Dyna, in a single engagement. It was one of the most remarkable aerial victories of the war. And it wouldn't have been possible without the stability Daniel Harmon's modification provided. Shomo later said in an interview, "The airplane let me fight. I didn't have to wrestle with it. I just pointed, fired, and moved to the next target. It was like the Mustang could read my mind." The numbers didn't lie. A 1-degree change in wing angle had transformed the P-51 from a good fighter into a dominant one. But the real impact was harder to quantify. Pilots flew more aggressively because they trusted their aircraft. They committed to attacks they might have hesitated on before. They pushed deeper into enemy territory knowing their Mustangs would respond predictably in emergencies. That confidence saved lives. One pilot wrote in a letter home, "Before the modification, we worried about the aircraft as much as the enemy. Now we just worry about getting home. The plane takes care of itself." By mid-1944, the P-51 Mustang had become the dominant American fighter in both theaters. It escorted bombers deep into Germany, fought Japanese Zeros over the Pacific, and provided close air support for ground troops from Normandy to Okinawa. And every single one of those aircraft flew with Daniel Harmon's 1-degree modification. The man who never designed an aircraft, never flown in combat, never worked for an aviation company, had fundamentally changed aerial warfare with nothing but geometry and a stubborn refusal to accept that impossible meant impossible. By the summer of 1944, Daniel Harmon's wing modification had become standard on every P-51 rolling off production lines. Over 8,000 Mustangs had been built or retrofitted with the Harmon angle. Pilots called it the best handling fighter in the war. But in the bureaucratic halls of the War Department, Daniel's contribution was being quietly erased. Official documents referred to the modification as Engineering Change Proposal 1-43A, developed by North American Aviation in collaboration with Army Air Forces technical staff. No mention of Daniel Harmon. No mention of a physics teacher. No mention of bridge-building principles applied to aircraft design. When a reporter from Aviation Week magazine tried to write a story about the modification, he was told the details were classified. When he asked specifically about Daniel Harmon's role, a Pentagon spokesman said, "All modifications to military aircraft are developed through proper engineering channels. We don't comment on individual consultants." The message was clear. The military didn't want the public knowing that one of their most successful aircraft improvements had come from a high school teacher with no aviation credentials. Daniel found out through a letter from Chief Engineer James Harrington. "Mr. Harmon, I thought you should know, your modification is now being credited to our engineering team. The Army requested we not mention your name in official reports. They believe it would undermine confidence in military procurement if civilians received credit for solving problems our engineers couldn't. I argued against this, but was overruled. You deserve better." Daniel read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. His wife Margaret found him in his garage that evening, working on a miniature suspension bridge. "Are you angry?" she asked. Daniel looked up from his work. About what? About them taking credit for your work. He shook his head. I didn't do it for credit. I did it because pilots were dying and I thought I could help. But they're acting like you don't exist. Daniel set down his tools. Margaret, I've been teaching physics to teenagers for 25 years. Most of them forget everything I taught them 2 weeks after graduation. But every once in a while, one of them uses something I showed them, some principle, some way of thinking, and it helps them solve a problem years later. He gestured toward the letter on his workbench. This is the same thing. It doesn't matter if anyone remembers my name. What matters is that the modification works. That pilots are coming home. That's enough. But some people did remember. In November 1944, Daniel received an unexpected visitor at his home in Pasadena, Colonel James Howard, the P-51 pilot who'd led the first combat mission with modified Mustangs over Germany. Howard stood on Daniel's porch in full uniform, holding a wooden box. Mr. Harmon, I'm here unofficially. The Army doesn't know about this visit, and they probably wouldn't approve. He held out the box. Inside was a pair of pilot's wings, the silver insignia worn by Army Air Force's aviators. These belonged to Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 357th Fighter Group. He was shot down over France in August but managed to bail out. He walked through enemy lines for 3 weeks before reaching Allied forces. When he got back, he wrote me a letter. Howard pulled out a folded paper and read. Sir, I want you to know that the only reason I'm alive is because that Mustang handled perfectly during the engagement. I took hits from 2 FW-190s, lost hydraulics, and still managed to maneuver well enough to reach friendly territory. Whatever they changed on these birds, whoever figured it out, saved my life. Please make sure they know. Howard looked at Daniel. He asked me to find out who was responsible for the modification. It took me 4 months to get your name. When I told him it was a civilian physics teacher, he insisted I give you his wings. He said I can get another pair. He earned these more than I did. Daniel stared at the silver wings, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't fly the aircraft, he said quietly. No, Howard agreed. But you made it possible for thousands of others to fly them safely. That counts. Similar letters arrived over the following months. Not official commendations, the Army wouldn't allow those. But personal thank yous from pilots who'd survived combat because their Mustangs handled precisely when it mattered most. One letter from Captain George Preddy, who had become one of the highest-scoring American aces with 26.83 victories, simply said, Mr. Harmon, I don't know if anyone's told you this, but your modification is the difference between a good fighter and a great one. I've flown against the Luftwaffe's best, and the P-51 outfights them because it does exactly what I need, exactly when I need it. Thank you for caring enough to figure it out. Another letter came from a mechanic at an airbase in Italy. Sir, I work on these planes every day. Before your modification, we'd see aircraft come back with stress damage from hard maneuvering, cracked spars, buckled panels. After the modification, the airframes hold up better. You didn't just make the planes fly better, you made them stronger. The engineers say the improved airflow reduces structural stress by distributing loads more evenly. I don't understand the science, but I see the results. The technical legacy of Daniel's work extended beyond the P-51. By late 1944, aircraft designers at other companies began studying the Harmon angle modification. They realized that optimizing the relationship between wing angle and fuselage alignment wasn't unique to the Mustang, it applied to all aircraft. Republic Aviation tested similar modifications on the P-47 Thunderbolt, finding modest improvements in high-speed stability. Lockheed applied the principle to the P-38 Lightning's wing-to-boom junction, reducing compressibility problems at high speed. Even bomber designers began reconsidering wing mounting angles, discovering that small changes could significantly improve handling during evasive maneuvers. The principle Daniel had discovered, that geometry mattered as much as aerodynamics, became foundational to post-war aircraft design. But publicly, he remained invisible. In December 1944, Daniel received a brief, formal letter from the War Department. Mr. Daniel Harmon, your consultancy contract with the Army Air Force's Technical Division is hereby concluded effective December 31, 1944. Your services are no longer required. Thank you for your contribution to the war effort. No medal. No official recognition. Just a form letter and a check for $2,400, 6 months of consultant pay at $400 per month. Daniel filed the letter away and returned to teaching. In January 1945, he stood in front of his physics class at Pasadena High School, teaching the same principles he'd always taught: force vectors, load distribution, the relationship between angle and stability. None of his students knew that those same principles had been used to modify the most important American fighter of World War II. And Daniel never told them. Because for him, the reward wasn't recognition. It was knowing that somewhere over Germany or Japan, a pilot was diving on an enemy aircraft, pulling into a hard turn, and trusting that his Mustang would respond exactly as needed. That trust, built on 1 degree of angle change, was all the recognition Daniel Harmon ever wanted. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across America, cities erupted in celebration. Church bells rang. Strangers embraced in the streets. Newspapers ran banner headlines: Germany surrenders. In Pasadena, California, Daniel Harmon sat in his garage, building a miniature truss bridge while his wife listened to the radio broadcast of President Truman's victory speech. Margaret called to him from the doorway. "Dan, the war's over in Europe. Aren't you going to celebrate?" He looked up from his work. "I am celebrating. This bridge won't collapse under load. That's worth something." She smiled. "You know what I mean." Daniel set down his tools and joined her on the porch. Down the street, neighbors were hanging flags and setting off firecrackers. Children ran laughing through yards. "They're celebrating because they won," Daniel said quietly. "I'm celebrating because some of them got to come home." By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the final statistics were undeniable. Over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had been produced during the war. Nearly 12,000 of them incorporated Daniel's 1-degree wing modification. Those aircraft had escorted bomber formations deep into Germany with minimal losses, achieved air superiority over both European and Pacific theaters, recorded kill-to-loss ratios that exceeded any other Allied fighter, brought thousands of pilots home alive. The modification had cost approximately $8 per aircraft to implement, less than $100,000 total for the entire fleet. The return on that investment was incalculable. But Daniel's contribution remained classified. In the months following the war, aviation magazines published detailed histories of aircraft development. The P-51 Mustang received extensive coverage: its design evolution, its combat record, its technical specifications. None of them mentioned Daniel Harmon. Engineering journals analyzed the Mustang's exceptional handling characteristics, noting the optimized wing mounting angle as a key factor in its success. They attributed the modification to ongoing aerodynamic refinement by North American Aviation's engineering team. Daniel read these articles without comment. His students sometimes asked if he'd worked on military projects during the war. He'd shrug and say, "I did some consulting. Nothing important." But the pilots knew. In 1946, a group of former P-51 pilots formed the American Fighter Aces Association. At their first reunion, someone proposed a toast: "To the engineers who gave us aircraft worth flying." Colonel James Howard stood up. "Gentlemen, there's someone you should know about." He told them about Daniel Harmon, the physics teacher who'd solved a problem that had stumped aviation's best minds. The man who'd changed the P-51's wing angle by 1 degree and transformed it from unstable to untouchable. The room went silent. Then every pilot stood. They raised their glasses toward an absent teacher in California who would never know about this moment. "To Daniel Harmon," Howard said. "The man who taught our Mustangs to fly."